Is the national debt crisis canceled? The US government just pulled off a jaw dropping $198 billion surplus in September, or did they? In this video, we're diving deep into the monthly Treasury Statement controversy. So here's the big picture. Since the end of the gold standard, the debt has grown by 104x. You can see basically vertical recently. Interest on the debt, or the cost of the debt, has grown by 42x. GDP, which is the economic activity off of which the debt can be serviced, has only grown by 29x. So what this means, again, the government is taxing GDP. So you need the overall pie to grow. The only problem, the pie's not growing nearly fast enough. We can see we've only gotten about 33 cents of return for each new dollar of debt we've gone into since 1971, or about 49 cents of return for each new dollar of debt that we've gone into since 2008. So here's the monthly Treasury Statement generating a ton of controversy. Over here on the left, you will see revenue for the government. Over here is government spending. We can see revenue for the month of September, 544 billion, spending 346 billion, mainly driven by Social Security, health, defense, and interest. That results in a surplus of 198 billion. But it doesn't really. So we'll take a look at that in a second. Here's the cumulative picture, which is much more important. On a cumulative basis, for the entire fiscal year, we can see revenue came in 5.2 trillion, mainly driven by individual income tax, and then total government spending for the government, $7 trillion, mainly driven by Social Security, Medicare, health, interest, and defense. That results in a deficit of $1.7 trillion. We can see that for the fiscal year, both revenue and spending both grew. So the deficit is about the same at about $1.8 trillion. Remember, you need to compare month to month because there can be tax deadlines or certain spending items that get put in a given month. So you need to compare September to September. We can see that revenue is about the same. Spending for the month of September is down slightly. Here we can see the resulting surplus, which is common in September, at least according to last year. The surplus is larger, but we'll get to that and whether or not that's accurate. So on a cumulative basis, again, we can see that revenue has grown over the cumulative amount through September 24, but spending has also grown on a cumulative basis. Again, the deficit is barely measurable in terms of any improvement. Here's revenue by source for the government. Again, largely driven by you, the individual income tax. Here is a bar chart for that revenue. And then here is spending for the government as a pie chart. And again, as a bar chart. So this is where the details really are. So individual income taxes grew. You'll see two columns, difference and then adjusted difference. And we'll get to what that is in a second. We can see individual income tax grew 7% raw, or 5% on an adjusted basis. For the year, individual income tax has grown by 6%. Only problem is corporate tax has actually declined 41% month to month, September 24 to September 25. And for the cumulative year, corporate tax has fallen by 14%. So you are paying 6% more and corporations are paying 14% less. Now, I want to make a note of the Federal Reserve earnings. As only the Fed can do, they record a deferred asset. They record a loss of about $250 billion. They record that as zero. Is actually, if you look at these Fed Reserve earnings that are supposed to be remitted to the Treasury, it's actually negative $250 billion. But as only the Fed can do, they record it as zero. Customs duties, tariff revenue has increased by 295% from September last year to September this year. And cumulative for the entire year, that represents a growth of 142%. Now, total revenue for the government, September to September, only grew by 2 or 3%. Now, on a annual basis, on a cumulative basis, grew by either 6% adjusted, 6% unadjusted, or 7% adjusted. Now, going down to the spending components, Medicare grew by 22% on a raw basis, 17% adjusted from September 24 to September 25. Remember, revenue only grew by 2 or 3%. Medicare is growing by 17 or 22%, depending on how you calculate it. And for the fiscal year, it is growing by 8% adjusted or 13% on a raw basis. Treasury interest on the debt grew by 8% from September last year to September this year. This represents about $3 billion per day in interest on the debt. And for the year, we can see that represents a growth in interest outlays of 7% year over year. Now, Social Security, that has grown by 7% on an adjusted basis or 8% on an unadjusted basis. And again, cumulative, it is 8% for both. Remember that revenue is only growing at 6 or 7%. We will look at a chart that displays this pretty perfectly. If we look at total government spending, this is really where that $198 billion surplus, quote unquote, comes from. We can see that according to the government, government spending has actually fallen by 23% on a raw basis or 18% on an adjusted basis. But the problem is, again, if you zoom out and look at the entire fiscal year, you can see that it has grown by 4% on a raw basis or 3%. So it is not shrinking as they would have you believe. And there are also adjustments being made due to calendar variations that we'll talk about in a second. As we can see, NM stands for not measurable or not meaningful. We can see that the net deficit is really not that different from September 24 to September 25. And if we take a look at it cumulative, again, 1.8 trillion for September, fiscal year 2024. Fiscal year 2025, 1.77 trillion, basically not much change at all. We are still running a very, very, very large deficit. So what are these adjustments about? Well, first I want to show this. So remember, it's very important to remember that the US government runs a twin deficit. So here, of course, the fiscal deficit, that is expressed as a share of GDP, which is really the way to think about it. We can see, of course, about 6% of GDP. Now, if we look at the current account, that is equally important, but much less discussed. The current account is mainly driven by the balance of trade or the trade balance. We can see that our current account deficit as a share of GDP is about 3%. So both of these are quite large. However, it should be noted the current account and the fiscal deficit have improved depending on when you start the clock. If you start the clock here, for example, when the current account deficit was 6% of GDP, only matched leading into the housing bubble, by the way, this is part of the reason the housing bubble happened, was we were running a 6% current account deficit. Again, what that means, the other side of that is a 6% of GDP capital and financial account surplus. So that has improved. We are only at 3% of GDP, and the fiscal deficit has improved ever so slightly to about 6% of GDP, as opposed to 7% of GDP where it had been running. So a marginal increase in terms of improvement in the deficit. Here is really what the problem is. So Social Security as a share of government revenue and Medicare as a share of government revenue. If we go back to 1966, Medicare as a share of total government revenue was only about 1% of total revenue for the government. It is now 24% of government revenue. Social Security, again, when it started, it was only about 14% of government revenue. It is now 30% of government revenue. So Medicare has grown significantly faster in terms of the outlays for Medicare and Social Security as well. Social Security payments or outlays have grown 2 times as fast as government revenue, and Medicare has grown even faster than that. Now, a lot of people always ask about defense spending. Here's defense spending as a share of government revenue. We can see that this has remained relatively flat over recent history and even declined slightly if we go back to 1965. Here is the total amount of spending for the government. And here I'm going to mention the adjustment that was being made. So there was an adjustment. We talked about the adjusted difference versus the raw difference. And that mainly addresses timing shifts in the outlays for the government or the spending components. This includes military items, military pay, VA benefits, Social Security, and Medicare. Those were accelerated from September 1st, which was a holiday, into late August, moving about $100 to $120 billion forward. Now, here, if we're looking at the 12-month average of government spending, you can see the bigger picture, which is that government spending is notably above what it was. They can do all sorts of little adjustments for calendar variations, but this is the trend that really matters, which is government spending increased significantly here from 2020, obviously. And we are not trying to reduce our spending. Generally, you try to see a reduction in the spending after a recession. We are not seeing that. And federal spending as a share of GDP is generally trending up. Right now, running at about 27%. The annual rate of change right now for government spending is growing at about 3% per year. Now, I want to make a mention that the CRFB noted that without that $88 billion timing adjustment for payments that were shifted from September to August due to the Labor Day holiday, which was again September 1st, that if it were not for that and the $130 billion one-time student loan portfolio savings, that the September 2025 would have actually shown a deficit rather than the $198 billion surplus. So again, the bigger picture sometimes is really what's important, which is Medicare outlays and Social Security outlays growing much faster than government revenue. And of course, the deficit and the current account deficit, both very, very large. Government spending is growing far faster than government revenue, which we can see, of course, federal spending as a share of GDP is trending upward right now, growing at about 3% rate of change year over year. The CBO, we mentioned the CRFB, the CBO, they also estimate that the full fiscal year deficit for 2025 was actually 1.8 trillion, but notes that when adjusted for all those timing shifts, including weekend effects and holiday effects, like we mentioned with Labor Day, it actually represents an $80 billion decline from fiscal year 2024, implying that the raw, unadjusted year over year improvement is actually much more small than they would have you believe. And of course, notably, the raw fiscal year deficit shrank by $41 billion or 2%, but adjusts to a 7% improvement of $126 billion. So this just represents how a holiday like a Labor Day can really throw a wrench into evaluating. That is why it's so important to zoom out and look at the larger trend, which is spending is up significantly. Pre-2020 spending was only running at about $4.5 trillion. We are running at about $7.1 trillion. We have almost doubled our spending on the spending side, and revenue, of course, has come nowhere close to keeping track. And of course, we need to mention the interest on the debt, which is driven by this. This is the U.S. yield curve, and we can see, of course, interest rates all across the curve are up and to the right, at least going back to what we were used to back here. Now, yields have come in a bit over the past couple weeks due to some growth concerns. You can see the correlation, by the way, between the 10-year yield and oil. You're seeing oil move lower on fears of lower growth. Yields are basically following almost one for one. But in general, they have basically been in a range up here. And again, the average weighted maturity or the average weighted interest rate on all the marketable debt is 3.3%. So even if you issued the debt at the lowest point on the curve right now, which is the 2-year treasury, that is at 3.46%. So no matter what you do, even if you issued and rolled all of our debt at the very, very lowest point on the curve, the interest is still going to go up. And again, it represents about 23% of all tax revenue. So for every dollar of tax that you pay, this is a simplification because, of course, we run a deficit to make up for this. But if we were fully funded by tax revenue, 23% of each dollar of tax revenue that you're paying the government, 23% would go to just the interest on the debt. Again, it works out to $3 billion per day. And of course, to finish up here, we are getting negative returns. We are not even getting a one-to-one return. Each new dollar of debt that we are going into, we are only getting diminishing returns. We're only getting 33 cents if you go back, zoom way out, or 49 cents of return for each new dollar of debt. This is a known phenomenon as the debt load increases, as you have a crowding out of productive investment, and so on and so forth. So, anyways, hopefully that was helpful. Again, I will link the two reports if you are curious and would like to go through it yourself. Hopefully that was helpful, and I'll catch you on the next.